So what does this mean to the 5% nation? What does this mean to us? One thing that it does mean is now we're more vulnerable and globally exposed than we've ever been before. You know, when you think about our nation going back to the 1960s and 70s, we were more communal, we were more close knit. There weren't different regions of our nation. There weren't really people who were living in different states, or definitely different countries, that were representing our nation as ambassadors in those outer realms. As you begin to go through those particular decades of the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, along with the growth and development of technology, we begin to be more exposed in the public domain. So when the father was teaching back in the 60s, there was no internet at that time. There was no such thing as content creation or social media. There was none of that. There weren't even computers at that time that were accessible to the everyday person. So the world and the lens through which he was seeing things, as well as the nine born and others who were around him, did not exist at the time the same way that we see this world today. Now, even though there are certain things that are still applicable that were taught during that time, the landscape has literally changed from the 60s and the 70s to today, 2020s. So we're more globally exposed as a nation than we've ever been before in the history of our nation. And you can see it online. You know, Laura Loomer, who is a journalist, and when the incident happened with the person that drove his vehicle into a protest march in Wisconsin, Laura Loomer, was the first person that identified Darrell Brooks by name. Prior to her, his name wasn't even in the public domain yet. She's the first person that identified him by name. And when she identified Darrell Brooks by name, she also associated him with the 5%. She associated him with us. So this is the narrative that was put out about this person that drove his vehicle into a protest march and killed people, that he's a 5%er. Also, Trump at the time had comments to make about this person. And you know the type of platform that he has in terms of the internet and social media. He comments on this person that was identified as being a 5%er. Also, just recently, early February, you had a man that was executed named Donald Grant, and the chaplain at the facility where he was shared this publicly about him before his execution. The chaplain said, the last 10 minutes before the execution, I tried to get him to focus on the people who love him, and I lifted him and them up in prayer. Then the curtain went up for the witnesses in the viewing chamber, and the death warrant was read. Donald's last words were a 2-minute rant about 5% ideology, including Brooklyn for Life, that made him sound like a lunatic to the witnesses. So the article goes on to just talk about how this person that got executed for murder was a 5%er and what a lunatic he was. Now, this is in the public domain. These are articles about us that we did not write, and by law, we don't have the legal authority to refute, right? And if you could look down on the bottom of the screen, this article, this narrative was shared in the mainstream news on Fox, CNN, NBC, CBS, all of the large media outlets. It was shared globally without our permission, and we had no control over this narrative being shared in the public about us. Just like what Laura Loomer said, no control. This is just a series of different articles in the public domain about us as the 5%. Sometimes it says that to many prison officials across the country, the 5%ers group is simply a violence-prone Black supremacist prison gang. Some people say we spread faith. We spread in faith or fantasy? We're known as racial supremacists or gangs. These are all of the narratives that are put in the public domain that gives people an idea of who we are to them. Now, some people will hear all that I'm sharing right now and say, I don't care, I'm building and I'm teaching. Well, that's not a practical solution to address this. And then you also have people in terms of e-commerce who are creating goods as well as producing services utilizing our universal flag. So over on the left, you see a shirt with the Wikipedia page of 5%, which we didn't create. So there's a lot of misinformation to that. You have hats being created by people. You also have hoodies being created by people that are outside of us. Here on Instagram, you have people creating gear with the universal flag on it that are not us. Over on the left-hand corner, you have this necklace that's being sold that was created by somebody outside of us. Mugs, books with our lessons in it with our universal flag for $75. All of these are examples of people freely using not only our cultural elements, but our universal flag to tell the world who we are. And yes, people have always done that since our inception or since the 60s. But the difference today is we live in an age of the internet and social media, where now we are more exposed than we have ever been before in the history of our nation. You also have a necklace being sold on Walmart for $400 of our universal flag, which is not us. Over on the right, you have social media pages that are created not by us, but people who want to be us, that are striving to create a narrative about who we are, which is not us. So you have all of these various different things that are going on in the public domain, which we are not initiating, that we don't have any control over legally. And then you can also look at this. When Mike Tyson did his Undisputed Truth performances, he talked about the 5%. So that is another instance of our cultural elements being inserted in the public domain. The Wu-Tang Saga American series, those of you who watched that, talking about the growth and development of Wu-Tang Clan, they have their various different aspects of our cultural elements in that show. And then Raising Kanan, that's on the Stars Network by 50 Cent. A couple of the characters use our language of supreme mathematics as a coded language for drug dealing. So you have these different elements in terms of film and television also in the public domain without our permission, that we did not initiate, that just like everything else that I've shown in the past few slides does not put us in a positive light. None of it puts us or places us in a positive light, and we don't have any control over that. So now we get to this question of intellectual property, because looking at this trajectory of technology, things are not going back to the 60s and 70s. We're living in the era now where the internet is here to stay, social media is here to stay, and we have to think about how can we remain present and relevant in this day and time and maintain our integrity as well as protect our cultural identity in a constantly growing environment, which has transitioned now into a metaverse, where now you have the introduction of blockchain technology and cryptocurrency and the creation of NFTs. things are constantly growing in that direction in terms of a trajectory of technology.